Hillsong, a megachurch exposed, 2022 Docu-Series by Apple Plus and others. Hi, I'm Guy Gifford, an apostle prophet, professional clergy who never seems to have enough money to not be below the poverty level, because I'm committed to truth and not to money. I'm neither a fan of Hillsong Church nor an enemy of them, nor an enemy of Jesus Church. After having watched all 3 hours of the docu-series, my summary is that this is an unfair hit piece. It's intended to say the very worst that it can about Hillsong Church, but the docu-series truly fails to factually support more than, I'd say, 3 failures of Hillsong Church. It spends great time telling everyone the already very publicly known fact that Pastor Cal Lentz of the New York City Hillsong franchise cheated on his wife and wasn't the wisest man or most noble man on earth. In the words of the classic line, that clergy should avoid grabbing the gold, girls, and glory for themselves, he grabbed the girls. That is entirely on Carl, who was a great dynamic speaker with the personal weakness of personal arrogance. Although the series worked very hard to claim that Carl grabbed the gold by showing many unrelated gold-abusing pastors in this segment, the one pair of $500 sneakers Carl is shown wearing is contrasted to the many multi-thousand-dollar shoes that it shows unrelated pastors to Hillsong wearing. Moreover, the one designer jacket that it showed Carl wearing may have just been given to him by his grateful friend Justin Bieber, who was in the photograph. Hillsong mainly got caught by the next problem. If you paid close attention, next we learned something new, and that was that the leader of the whole Hillsong Church movement, Brian Houston, was not a very good church manager or movement manager by failing to install protections for the church movement to stop individuals from grabbing the gold, girls, or silver for themselves. He was a bad manager. Not completely bad, but not as good as he should have been. I wrote in the book Name Your Baby's Destiny based on my study of persons' names and their personal characteristics, and I could have told you in advance that any and every Brian would have been lacking in that area of Christian mega movement management. Brian Houston just resigned 3 days ago. Brian failed to hold the leaders under him to the straight and narrow path, though it would have been hard to do over such distances as the whole entire global world. For such a mega church movement of young adults, Hillsong was expected to have some moral problems in its leadership ranks, and it did. For the mega size that the docu-series says that Hillsong movement is, Hillsong was really only accused of very few moral failures, and these were by individuals other than Brian Houston, who made the failures. But what the docu-series repeatedly said, but absolutely failed to prove, was that Brian Houston would have known about the moral failures of all of the leaders and the people under him, especially since Hillsong is so huge and covers the world. It was just a ridiculous accusation. Finally, the docu-series attempts to mud Brian Houston and the whole Hillsong movement for Brian Houston's father's, Frank Houston's, ancient pedophilia, of which Brian didn't know anything until 5 years before Frank died, and then Frank, sadly, included Brian in Frank's attempt to make amends. Of course, Christianity teaches that making amends is important, It also teaches that no person is to be held liable for one's parents' sins, which is only obvious. Moreover, Frank had never been in leadership at a Hillsong church, as Hillsong had been reorganized out of Frank's son's mission church. The docu-series never accused Brian of any personal moral failure, as it tried very hard to mud Brian with his father's dirt. In America, we have what is called clergy penitent non-disclosure rights, similar to lawyer-client rights, allowing the penitent to get counsel on repentance to be restored to godliness and privacy. Apparently, Australia, which isn't known for their human rights record, Australia doesn't have this important right to help its citizens. So because Brian was told of his father's pedophilia 36 years after it had happened, Australia says that by new law, Brian was required to inform the police, although the victim had never informed the police at that point, and the victim was now over 40 years old. Clearly, there's something screwy about that law. We also learn that one or two other leaders in the Hillsong mega movement had moral failures, such as a drunk employee who groped a woman. But by far, most of the docu-series was a handful of reporters and very, very few people who had previously been involved in the movement giving their unsupported or wild opinions and accusations over and over and over again. What kind of opinions? That Hillsong was only in it for greed, 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 and to do some unnamed harm by reaching the world for Jesus, by helping the world morally. I especially laughed when, after a hired flunky private detective declared that it was somehow morally wrong for a mega-sized religious movement with many mega-sized ministries to have divisions and corporations and to be intelligently structured similar to businesses. Since this guy had only been in small churches. Remember, the average sized church is 50 persons. And if that's the size of church he was in, of course it didn't need anything more than one corporation. And how he felt, and how this detective felt it was wrong that Hillsong owned 30 land parcels for their college in Arizona, with only one of them worth $9 million. With the current average price of a house in California nearly $1 million, I can't imagine the main building of a college being worth as little as $9 million. Another accusation was that the New York City Hillsong had a VIP section. Like the accusation that churches are not allowed to act intelligently with organization, what church doesn't have reserved seating for at least the pastor, his staff, special guests? Of course, a mega church could be expected to have a mega sections, including a larger than average VIP section. And since a celebrity should have the same right to pray, worship God, and learn without being pawed by fans or selfied or interrupted, I would hope that every church would care that national celebrities would not be harassed in church. The docu-series repeatedly bandied around the term cult, but only the most minor element of a true cult was even being hinted at. The docu-series constantly claimed greed, but it never proved greed, nor did it even show any consistent greedy inconsistencies. The docu-series constantly claimed systematic abuse, but only showed a few abuses, and these only anecdotal incidences by individuals. The typical claim of abuse was the volunteer who, after a year of loving what he was doing, got burned out and not having better balance in his life, was now accusing the church of abuse for his volunteering. One young woman complained that she had to sign a digital non-disclosure agreement, barring her from distributing Hillsong's proprietary and highly sought-after music and behind-the-scenes videos. It shocked me how really dumb the accusations against Hillsong were. But if you have naive, innocent, dumb people hearing this docu-series, I can see how many would believe that this hit piece is trying to believe what this hit piece is trying to propagandize. One blue-haired young woman claiming abusive management made a bunch of unsubstantiated and even counter-substantiated accusation against their child protection system called Red Light, Greenlight. She was concerned because they had a policy to not have unmarried volunteers who had fornicated within a year to work with children, which of course is a sensible policy, but she didn't want to be excluded from working with the children. In the Hillsong interview, she admitted that she'd allowed her boyfriend to get her drunk and have sex with her, yet Hillsong hadn't red lighted her. They let her have positions with children. She claimed that she wasn't responsible for her getting drunk and having sex, claiming that her boyfriend forced her to get drunk before the sex, and not even her testimony proved that she was actually forced to do either of these. Although this woman was claiming abusive administration from Hillsong, she really proved that Hillsong gave her unjustified grace. Included in the few bad-mouthing disgruntled was a young woman who'd come from America to go to their Sydney college. The airlines had lost all her luggage, and the American government check, which she'd planned to live off of when she arrived, hadn't arrived at college by the time she'd arrived, and she seemed to somehow, and I don't know how, be blaming the airline's failure and the U.S. government's failure, blaming it on Hillsong. Anybody who'd been in this situation of the government checks coming on time to the beginning of school know that schools are always regularly not getting their checks on time and having to wait for a week or 2 or 3 before the check arrives to make the payment. As I said, to intelligent people who pay attention to the details, it was clearly an intentional, unfair hit piece. One of the docu-series' classic distortions it reportedly used along with innuendo was irrelevant time period events, such as Carl Lentz's high school reputation and Frank Houston's pre-Hillsong and external to Hillsong history. Moreover, the docu-series did very briefly feature a few who had good things to say about Hillsong. But as a documentary, it really didn't document or expose Hillsong Church so that people would understand it. With apparently hundreds of thousands of active participants and 30 churches, the documentary didn't show the lines of people going into each church, and it didn't show random interviews of people coming out of the churches, all which would have had said how great it was. With so many thousands of people who attended Hillsongs, this really only showed us that out of the hundreds of thousands of people, it seemed only a handful could be found who were disgruntled, which could be found for any such sized organization. Moreover, with the many CNN moral failures recently and DNC moral failures recently, this was a ridiculous attack on a virtually innocent organization in comparison. In summary, they did show that Hillsong megachurch had some exceptional leaders with typical weaknesses, but definitely not worse than similarly sized organizations. An in-depth study of the Docu-Series that I did, I really found it to be an unjustified hit piece. What it showed me was that for the size of the Hillsong mega movement, it really seemed much safer and less abusive than would be expected, and much, much safer than would have happened in a secular organization of the same size. And that's my review.
If you liked my video, be sure to select like, as well as subscribe, and select notify to not miss future great videos.